The tulips trembled in my hands the moment she said it. Hazel Winters stood at the head of the glass-walled atrium like a new executive version of sunlight, bright, unblinking, hard enough to cast everyone else into shadow. She wore a tailored slate suit and a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. Behind her, the crowd in the lobby clustered in a semicircle. The people whose lives hummed because Ashford Industries hummed. Project managers, analysts, the receptionist with her nameplate, a scattering of directors. My assistant Maya clutched the strap of her tote as if it were an anchor. Daniel Reeves folded his arms, the way men do when they want to look calm and are anything but. Patricia Chin hovered near the steps, careful and still, like she belonged to a different temperature. Hazel's mouth moved. "Charlotte, no, wait. Rachel, is it? Pack your desk." For a second, my mind went as blank as the white card that sat under the bouquet. The tulips made a small rustle against the satin ribbon. I could feel every eye relearning the contours of my face, as if I was some new exhibit. Someone laughed, low and uncomfortable. Someone else cleared their throat, loud enough to be almost a sound of mourning. "Pack your desk," she repeated, as if the phrase itself were a ceremonial dismissal. It landed like a gavel. What I remember first is the cold. It was not physical. The atrium was warm. It was that sudden frost that settles inside the chest when something that has always been true becomes suddenly negotiable. 23 years at Ashford. 23 years of learning how to read quarterly reports as if they were scripture, of sleeping on the floor of expansion flights, of hiring, firing, negotiating, apologizing, reduced in the space of one practiced breath to an inbox, a clearance card, a storage box. "No, you're mistaken," I heard myself say. My voice sounded small, privileged by surprise. I looked at Hazel and expected maybe a second of hesitation. Instead, her smile sharpened. "I'm not mistaken," she said. "We have a new direction. We need fresh leadership. Please gather your things. Security will escort you to human resources." She pronounced it with corporate tenderness, the kind designed to spare the company legal trouble more than to spare anyone's dignity. A woman from corporate affairs produced the cardboard boxes, the kind with the brand's logo, clean edges, reliable. Maya stepped forward without asking and took my arm. Her fingers trembled as she touched my sleeve. People moved like weather around us, diffused pity, curious relief, embarrassed murmurs. Someone called my name correctly and then faltered, unsure whether this was an act of loyalty or a curiosity to be watched. The receptionist's fingers hovered too long over the phone, as if dialing might conjure a different script. Daniel's jaw tightened. I could see him assessing cost and consequence in the space between heartbeats. Patricia's face was calm, but I could read the calculation behind it. The board members who had consented to Hazel's appointment watched with the composed detachment of judges who know their verdicts have consequences. Hazel's words were a clean cut. "Pack your desk, Rachel," she had said. For a fraction of a beat, the wrong name became its own cruelty. She didn't even get the humiliation right. She didn't bother with the tiny kindness of getting my name wrong. It was an erasure, a way to make me not just dismissed but misremembered. I took the box with both hands, and in that small, ridiculous moment, the tulips hit the edge of the cardboard and toppled. A stem bent and a petal fell, catching on the corrugated lip like a living comma. Someone muttered, apologizing as if the flower had been a fragile emblem and we had been collectively careless. I did not shout. I did not demand to see legal. I did not storm the lobby in a cinematic scene that would make for a memorable resignation. I picked up the tulips, placed them in the box atop my stapler, my coffee mug with the faded chip, the photograph in the silver frame of my mother laughing at a picnic in Seattle. The image of that laugh, my mother's laugh, a sound I had missed at the hospice bedside, slid under the tulips like a secret. Maya packed with deliberation. "I'm so sorry," she said. "They said—" and her voice cracked, before she could complete the sentence that would have made this less clinical. Daniel hovered with an affable awkwardness that covered a very different kind of loyalty. Patricia's fingers hovered over my wrist. She said nothing. When the security team walked me to the elevator, the lobby's light made the glass walls feel like transparency without mercy. I pressed the elevator button and felt the weight of everyone watching. The hum of it was a chorus of refrigerators, of fluorescent lighting, of a building that contained 1,000 small compromises. If I replayed that scene 100 times afterward, if I imagined what I might have said, how I might have struck my fist on a table or flipped my badge in a cinematic gesture, what stayed with me was not the heat of righteous anger. It was the memory of my mother's hand in mine 2 years earlier, a hospital bed at dawn, me choosing a conference call over a ride to the morphine drip because a merger hung in the balance. It was the long ledger of choices that had added up to this precise moment of erasure. After the elevator doors closed, Maya leaned in and said the thing she had been trying to say without forming words. "If you want me to fight—" "No," I said, "not here." I wanted to say that the fight she imagined, an immediate, raw exposure of Hazel's cruelty, would be satisfying in a way that meant nothing. I wanted to say that the fight would be a public spectacle, and that spectacle was how Hazel built power, by making people tremble and then showing them their own trembling. I wanted to say that I would not give her that joy. But none of that would explain the tighter truth, that a quiet part of me had always believed the pen mattered more than the shout. 3 days earlier, in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and lemon soap, Eleanor Ashford had handed me a fountain pen. It was a small thing in the moment. She had held it between her fingers and traced the gilt letters on the cap as though reading Braille. The pen had weight, a balanced, old-world heft, and it made the kind of soft metallic sound you associate with libraries and ledgers. She smiled that thin smile she saved for serious people or good students. "Don't sign anything in haste," she said. "You know that, Charlotte." I did. I nodded, feeling the edges of her warning. Eleanor Ashford had been my mentor, the architect of my career, the woman who'd shown me the circuitry of a company and how to trace its fault lines. She had taught me how to hold a meeting so everyone felt heard while she was the only one steering it. She taught me to read people by the tenderness in their emails. She taught me that strategy is patience given a calendar. Eleanor had been sick for months. The diagnosis came in a paper-coded sort of way. The word metastasis arrived like a line item on an overdue invoice. She practiced her authority at the hospital with a calm that made the nurses look like they were performing an honor guard. I would have taken anything from her in those weeks, a note, a look, a recipe. She gave me a video, a portfolio thick with documents, and the fountain pen, her most private instrument for executing decisions. "You'll need to wait," she told me, in that recorded message that I watched in half-sleep, tears blurring the playback like a smear. Her voice was the same voice she used in conference rooms, but slower, softened by something that was both gravity and affection. "You will be angry. You will be ashamed. You will want to step in and make everything right immediately. Don't. The timing matters." She explained that she had rearranged her estate to effect a transfer of majority shares to me, effective 3 days after her death. Not a cryptic note, not muttered wishes over a hospital pillow. Legal instruments, notarized, set on a calendar. The documents were sealed in the portfolio, accompanied by a directive that the transfer be made public through the proper filings. There was to be no dramatized handover, no clandestine meeting in a dark parking garage. The transfer would become effective in the light of process. Signatures, notarizations, the SEC genuinely notified in the ordinary course. "If you follow the timetable," Eleanor said, "you will have something they cannot take from you in a fit of charisma." When she died, I was at the hospice, and the world outside continued to ask for things as if nothing had changed. arranging a funeral is like managing a production. People expect choice music, certain faces, an ordered procession. I remember the smell of lilies, the whisper of a program being passed forward, the way people lined up to shake my hand, as if offering it would supply what I had lost. I remember the card at the front of the guest book with my name spelled correctly. Small verifications mattered now. After the reading, when the crowd had thinned to relatives and a handful of board members, Patricia handed me the portfolio. I had felt the shift of her fingers like an omen. Inside were the notarized stock transfer documents, carefully prepared, clearly dated, with language plain enough for any competent lawyer to set on a desk and nod. There were instructions about the public notification and a clause mandating that I wait 3 days before taking any action related to the ownership. The pen lay on top like a sutra, polished and purposeful. That it was legal and visible in ordinance made it irrevocable. Eleanor wasn't leaving power to chance or sentiment. She had used the law like a loom to weave a safety net. She wanted to teach you patience, Patricia said in a low voice. And she wanted you to have the tools to finish what she started. Tools. The word cut into me the way instruments do, useful but impersonal. Tools have no need for forgiveness, only for purpose. Eleanor's tools would give me the authority I needed, legal majority, but they wouldn't undo the ledger of costs and choices that had brought me here. Missed birthdays, funerals I had postponed, a child's recital I had listened to on speakerphone. The gift was a river, and I was dipping in my hands. I had to decide whether to drink. Eleanor's last wish was not tender. It asked me to accept the humiliation that might come and to use that humiliation as a lens. She wanted a test, to see what Hazel would reveal when given power disguised as kindness. I understood then that the way she died was itself a strategy, one that required me to be patient to the point of seeming cowardice. "You'll have to let it sting for a little while," she said in the video, her eyes never leaving mine through the screen. "Let her show who she is. Proof matters. The company will listen to evidence." It should have been such a simple instruction. Wait. Do nothing visible. Accumulate proof. But patience is a practice that requires more than obedience. It requires a sacrifice of a different kind. The kind I had been paying without realizing the bill was accumulating. Back in the lobby, with the tulip petal folded in the cardboard and faces scanning for their cues, I imagined Eleanor's voice like a metronome. Wait. Prove it. Do not stoop to the level of response the world expects from the humiliated. It was a gospel of restraint, of process, of the law's ability to correct what charisma distorts. After security closed the elevator door and the floor slid up, the building sighed, and for a moment I believed I could carry the rest of the afternoon in a clean box. But the biography of a person isn't stored in a single container. It leaks out. Names on badges, the scent of coffee on a mug, the tiny dent where a pen has struck a ledger. My identity, built over 2 decades, rested on 1,000 small certainties. A dismissal threatened to rewrite them as if they were footnotes. Outside the building, the city kept its steady traffic. I walked to the parking garage with the cardboard box under my arm. People who had been colleagues in the morning deferred their eyes, as though corporate norms now declared a taboo. I could tell that on some faces the thought had already passed. She must have known if she stayed this long. On others, the thought was sharp and immediate. She tried to get in the way. The rumor mill hurtled faster than the facts. I learned later that Hazel's appointment had come wrapped in presentation decks and a tidy narrative about fresh starts and restructuring. It was the tidy narrative that made the dismissal plausible to those who hadn't seen the ledger of my work. My car smelled faintly of coffee and old upholstery. I laid the tulips across the passenger seat and drove home with the radio as static. The city blurred into streaks. I thought about the photograph in the frame, my mother's laugh preserved on glossy paper. I had been with her when she died in the practical sense. I had signed forms, held the medication tray when the nurse needed an extra hand, arranged for the obituary. But I hadn't been the presence she needed in the small hours, when guilt is not stated, but is measured in breaths left unsaid. I had chosen work over a walk in the park, over a last conversation that was not about balance sheets. Those choices made me powerful in one world and absent in another. That absence would be a ledger line I would never reconcile easily. It showed in the way my hand trembled when I took a call from my sister. "You were always working," she said, not unkindly, and in the way I felt as if I were balancing plates. Eleanor's death, Hazel's arrival, the portfolio, my mother's funeral, all of it seemed calibrated into a lesson that only patience could make visible. The next morning the email started. Company restructuring read subject lines like discreet knives. The press release described Hazel as a visionary change agent, as though corporate language could baptize cruelty into innovation. Her first moves were tidy and theatrical. A memo about streamlining in order to reorganize teams, a public insistence on empathy alongside efficiency, which is always a confusing combination. She spoke in the language of pivot and scalability, while laying out plans that beneath the spreadsheet projections spelled layoffs. I listened to a recording later, an unguarded clip one of the junior managers sent me, voice shaking with the thrill of gossip. Hazel telling a small group that sentiment was expensive and that Ashford needed to be leaner. She laughed, a sound like a hinge. The clip lived on my phone like a small, secret conscience. Publicly, Hazel cultivated a persona, approachable, energetic, the kind of person who remembers your name if your name is an asset. Privately, locks clicked. The HR inbox filled with pleas. Daniel fielded a few of them with the steady pragmatism that made him indispensable. "I can't sleep, my mortgage," the sign-offs read. I felt something clavicle deep, responsibility, and the bitter knowledge of how much had been asked of others in the name of turns I did not authorize. Eleanor's instructions pulsed in my thoughts like a heartbeat. Wait. Prove it. The legal transfer would take effect in 3 days. If I acted now, I would play into Hazel's hands. If I waited, things could unfold and reveal the decisions she would make when her rhetoric met the ledger of human consequence. There was also anger, music with a steadier beat. It traveled through me in discreet, unspectacular flashes. The memory of the wrong name, a press release that read like a personality profile, a junior analyst's email that asked if there was any hope. The temptation to strike was honest and ugly. I wrote an angry email once, fingers flying, then deleted it. I called Daniel and told him to save the recording. He asked questions with the deliberateness of someone who wanted to build evidence, not theater. Patricia was a quieter ally. She had been on the board since before Hazel's arrival and had watched the company survive boom and bust. We met at a small lunch table off the atrium. The sunlight through the glass made her hair a rim of silver. She pushed a cup of tea in my direction like an offering. "You know the rules," she said. Her voice had the judicious flatness of someone who had been calibrated by committee votes. "You follow them. You don't permit yourself the luxury of a temper tantrum. Eleanor wouldn't have wanted spectacle. She wanted results." "But the humiliation," I began. "Yes," Patricia replied. "Humiliation is a currency in corporate worlds because it buys obedience. You must not convert it into spectacle." So I listened. I persuaded Maya to make no public statements. I told Daniel to secure the recordings. I called Marcus Webb, an investor whose temper was as reliable as his interest in the company. Marcus had been involved in early rounds and had a share that was mostly public knowledge. He could not overturn a board unilaterally, but he could, in his own way, be a persuasive voice. He asked for documents and proof, and for a meeting that felt like an audit. Show me the portfolio, show me Eleanor's directive, prove to me that this wasn't some private vendetta. I showed him the documents. Marcus did what investors do. He read the signature lines, the notarizations, the effective dates. He was quiet while he considered the weight of legal certainty. "This is clean," he said at last, not in triumph, but as if concluding an analysis. "You did not have an easy way to do this. Either Eleanor wanted to ensure stability, or she wanted to make a point." "Both," I said. "Then be deliberate," he advised. "You're not there yet." The days that followed felt oddly theatrical in their dullness. Waiting, it turns out, is not a single act, but a long series of small disciplines. I went into the office under a different name. If I told anyone, I told them I was there for a file, for the funeral arrangements, or for a meeting with a vendor. I sat in a coffee shop with treacherous windows and watched the building breathe in the afternoon. I packed and unpacked a cardboard box multiple times, rearranging the mug, the photo, the stapler, as if sorting the memory into order might change the present. In those quiet hours, I replayed decisions in which I had chosen work over presence. I remembered my mother's face, the thinness of it, the chastened humor in it when she asked why I hadn't come earlier to sit with her. "I know the difference between work and life," she said once. And it was less a rebuke than an observation. I had not believed her. I had thought, in my stubborn way, that my devotion to the company was its own measure of life. It was an argument that sits quietly in a person's marrow. To what do you give your hours, and what will you own at the end? Eleanor had made a different calculation, and then asked me to complete it. Her calculus was not about punishment, but about stewardship. She had asked me to endure the small public humiliation as the price of greater, more structural correction. It was not a clean lesson. It left a taste like old metal at the tongue of the soul. Rumors bloomed. There were whispered conversations by the elevators and glances that were briskly averted. A junior account manager, Sandra, sent a message to Maya asking if I had a plan. A security guard, who had once saved me from a stuck elevator, nodded with the sympathy reserved for people who know you in small crisis and didn't have to profit from it. The company newsletter had a photograph of Hazel clapping for a presentation, and beneath it a quote about vision. It felt to me like a photograph at a wake, both too crisp and oddly lifeless. At night, I watched the tulips droop in their box and thought of Eleanor's fountain pen. I would take it out and roll it between my fingers, feeling the weight of it. At that weight, the temptation to use it for a different kind of ink rose, the temptation to sign and to claim what I held without waiting for the clock to tick the 3 days. But Eleanor's handwriting in that final video had been clear in more ways than one. When the law is used as a lever, you must let the lever do its work. On the afternoon of the funeral, Hazel sent a condolence note to the family that had the right tone and not too much feeling. It read like all the memos she had been circulating, sympathetic but sterile, a hand offering something in the shape of warmth. That was when the second humiliation arrived, a press release that framed her as the one to carry forward the company's new era, not as the interim, but as the future. The release had been written with a certain rhetorical lightness that made the death a symbolic passing of an old guard to a new one. It read as though Eleanor's legacy were a cloak Hazel had worn before she knew its weight. I watched Hazel on a news segment, speaking calmly about culture and toughness. She said the word tough with the precise kindness of someone who has read a dozen leadership books and chosen sentences from each. I thought of the art of war, its cracked spine in my office, its stained pages underlined in pencil. Eleanor had gifted me a copy years ago, its margins full of notes on patience, on timing, on restraint. She had said, "Little victories add to a life, but they do not build a legacy." I had kept the book not as a weapon, but as an instruction manual for seasons when tactical patience mattered more than theatrical victory. On the second day, a rumor leaked. one of those small, inexorable things that moves through the corporate bloodstream. Hazel was proposing a wave of reorganizations to prove her mandate. Names appeared on an internal memo like creased tokens. I felt my mouth go dry, an old adrenaline that had gotten used to midnight calls and crisis meetings. The temptation to stop her right then was enormous. I called Daniel. "Record everything," I said, "and make sure the junior teams keep all their emails." He was calm as a man who had been in 1,000 operational fires. "We won't give her ammunition to say you're clandestinely stirring, Charlotte," he said. "We collect facts. We don't act like a mob." "We don't play her game," I replied. "That's the point." Patricia arranged for me to see a copy of the proxy materials that would be part of any formal action on Friday. We would need to notify the SEC to formalize any switch in majority control. It had to be done publicly and filed correctly. The transfer, Eleanor's documents made plain, would become effective not by rumor or by rumor's currency, but by proper visible filings. The discipline of that sort of legality is not romantic. It is not the stuff of headlines. It is the architecture behind stability. And yet there was another cost, the kind I had been paying for years without ledgering. In the evenings I found myself replaying a small private argument, my mother's last months, the way I had justified staying for a product launch rather than a bedside. I had told myself the company needed me. I told myself that someone had to carry the torch. The company had been a refuge and a test. Eleanor had been both mentor and mirror. She reflected what diligence could make of a person, and she exposed how much of my identity had leached into my work. That realization hurt more than Hazel's public cruelty. The scar tissue that adaptive work builds is invisible until it is tugged upon. When the third day arrived, I sat in my kitchen with the portfolio closed like a small coffin on the table. The documents were there, notarized, dated, every I dotted in the kind of meticulousness that makes lawyers put their feet up and say that good work has been done. I ran my fingers over the pen, feeling its cold metal. Waiting had cost me the humility that comes with humiliation and the small piece of immediate anger. It had also cost me visible influence. I was a private majority owner, a paradox that felt like a contrivance from a parlor game. I thought of Eleanor's words. Let her show who she is. There was a cruelty to that instruction. If cruelty is the right word for a teacher who knows her student well enough to expect failure. She had not asked me to be a martyr. She had asked me to be a steward who could live with the necessary decisions for a better end. That afternoon, Hazel sent an internal message announcing a town hall at 9 Friday morning. The subject line was full of positivity. The body promised transparency about future direction. The senior leaders who had supported her appointment sent short, courteous confirmations. Marcus texted me a single line. If we do this right, we change nothing by drama. I went to bed that night with the pen on my nightstand and the photo of my mother under the pillow like an accusation. I slept badly. Waiting does strange things to a mind. It amplifies the small things, a missed phone call, the way the refrigerator hums too loud, the echo of strangers' voices in the corners of rooms. It makes the present feel like an accordion, compressed and stretched. On Friday morning, I wore a suit that Eleanor would have approved. Classic, neutral, practical. I drove to the building early. The lobby smelled like coffee. The morning light made the atrium glass glance like a shield. Employees streamed in with the ordinary choreography of a corporation. Badges tapped, greetings exchanged with machine politeness. Hazel arrived like the sun moved into the room and then refused shade. She had prepared an opening, PowerPoint, anecdotes about customers, a vision diagram that suggested action. She stood at the lectern with the practiced charisma of people who have rehearsed their empathy. At 9 she began. Her presentation was brisk, economic. She spoke of growth, efficiency, how markets demanded nimbleness. She announced a plan to reorganize departments, consolidate teams, and evaluate headcount for redundancy. Her language was clear. Nothing personal, only necessary. The photo behind her slid through graphs and bullet points, each designed to make a person feel small to protect the company's margins. I sat in the third row, a bouquet of drained tulips resting in my lap, and watched. Maya stood at the back like a small island of nervous energy, clutching her handbag. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead, jaw set. Patricia watched impassively. Marcus had a stoic expression, as if the meeting were an exercise in empirical study. Halfway through Hazel's section on streamlining, a notification chirped. Maya's phone beeped, a small sound that was absurdly loud in the hush of business rhetoric. She looked at me and mouthed, "It's the SEC." My chest went cold in an animal way. The fluorescent lights seemed sudden and too bright. Hazel faltered briefly, which was all the time the world needed to breathe. Maya's message was terse. SEC filing received. Notice served. She had been watching a thread. Someone in legal had forwarded the public notice, and it landed in her inbox like a weight. In an instant, the rhetoric of the room met the reality of process. The public filing showed the transfer effective at 9 a.m. Friday, 3 days after Eleanor's death. The transfer was live, exact, legal. Hazel's face, for the first time in months, showed something like confusion. She looked like someone whose script had been lost. She had built her authority from verb and gesture, and now the law, with its flat inked signatures, asserted itself like an immovable object. I stood. The bouquet in my hands was an architectural collapse, petals bent, stems soft. I walked to the podium without applause and without the drum of a crowd. The audience watched as if this were a turn in a serial drama. I put the portfolio on the lectern and opened it, revealing the documents and the pen. The sunlight on the atrium made the gilt on the fountain pen wink like a small star. "Eleanor gave me these," I said. My voice did not shake. It found the plainness needed for weight. "She transferred majority ownership to me, effective this morning." The room made that particular silence that people make when they realize an argument they have been rehearsing in private is suddenly a matter of public record. Heads turned. Emails were opened. Phones glowed with the same obdurate curiosity. Hazel's mouth had the shape of someone considering rebuttal. Her hands found the lectern as if it were a lifeline. "Charlotte," she said, This cannot be." "You'll find the filing," I said. "It's been submitted and received. The transfer was notarized and dated. It follows the clauses she specified." The board members in the room reacted like judges presented with proof. Marcus's hand went up, and I felt the motion like a relief valve opening. Patricia sat straighter. Daniel's expression had a charitable incredulity that felt like an anchor. Hazel's face hardened into an expression I had seen only in the rarest, most crystalline moments. The face of someone who is losing the narrative she had written. Her speech faltered. The words, "executive transition," were suddenly less persuasive than the cold exact law. She had won an opening by rhetoric and timing, but Eleanor's pen in the registrar's process had eroded that victory into something else. There are few things in life as clarifying as documentation. It does not raise the roof. It does not undo the small cruelties. But it is a kind of truce that sits on a table and waits for people to adjust their faces to it. I felt a convolution of emotions. Triumph in the sense that the law had been right and my belief in process vindicated. Sorrow for what had been required to get there. Guilt that this vindication required other people to have been frightened and uncertain, and abiding self-reproach for the ledger lines in my private life. The chair at the board's head had my name in the calendar now, but names on calendars do not mend the places where life has been unattended. Hazel had one more thing to do. She could storm, or she could salvage. She could attempt to fight the legality with procedural attacks. She could attempt to frame her removal as a coup and rally the board, but she didn't. For reasons of her own, pride, calculation, an appetite for dignity and defeat, she chose to offer the company a staged resignation. The cameras and the staff recorded the scene with the emotional nakedness of corporate theater. I remember Hazel's final words as if they were a stage direction. "I gave everything I had to the company," she said. "This is not the end. I will not be intimidated." Her voice was measured. It had the dignity of someone who imagines exit as a continuation of narrative. She left. Her footsteps on the atrium floor echoed like a small punctuation. I remained, holding the pen that had once belonged to a mentor and now belonged to me. The tulips in the box were wilting, their petals sagged like flags. My office, which had been packed in the day of my humiliation, stood as a place to reclaim, not to gloat. People gathered in small clusters. There were embraces, awkward and sincere. Junior staffers filed past me with smiles that were careful. Some thanked me. Others looked at me as though I were an afterthought in their day. The company felt both the same and different, as if the architecture had not changed, but the weather had. I did not step into the CEO's office that day. I had not called a press conference. I had not drafted a manifesto. The transfer had made me majority owner in law, but leadership is a different muscle. It takes bone and practice, and the exercise of listening. Eleanor's sealed letter remained unopened in the portfolio. A small envelope addressed to me with her handwriting, corners softened. It contained permission to leave or to stay, an impossible choice wrapped in the gentleness of her training. That envelope would wait. For now I sat at my desk, placed the fountain pen across an empty page, and realized that what had been reclaimed was not a throne, but a responsibility. The board would need convincing, the staff would need reassurance, and somewhere inside me the ledger of a mother's last months would continue to tally. I let the pen sit. The tulips drooped into a shadow. The building hummed with the low machinery of business as usual, and in that hum there was a new, awkward music, that of a leader learning that justice through process is quieter than the poetic satisfaction of revenge, but that it requires a steadier heart. If you believe loyalty deserves more than dismissal, subscribe. The work ahead would not be a single speech or a triumphant memo. It would be a rehearsal in ethics and governance, a slow reclamation, and an honest assessment of the costs that had been paid and would be paid by others. I had not been immune to the desire for spectacle, to the human hunger for immediate recompense. I had felt it like a fever. But Eleanor had trained me in tactics that treat time as the primary weapon. She had shown me that patience, when practiced like a craft, could turn humiliation into a lever. The first meetings after the transfer were procedural. Calls to regulators, confirmations of filings, a procession of boardroom faces who adjusted their alliances to the new legal reality. Patricia and Marcus were my steadiers, Daniel my operational point, and Maya my heartbeat on the floor. I began in small increments to ask questions I had avoided for the sake of expedience in the past. How many families would be affected by the proposed reorganizations? How many people were at risk of losing their livelihoods in Hazel's plan? The numbers mattered, and so did the narratives behind them. I convened a private meeting with the heads of departments. It was short and practical. I did not make grand promises. I did not try to ride rhetorical highs. Instead, I asked for reports, for handicaps, for human stories. The names resurfaced: the receptionist who supported her elderly mother, the production supervisor with 2 children, the analyst who drove a long commute. Every statistic was a person. That simple arithmetic translated corporate abstraction into human weight. My presence had an effect, an initial relaxation in the room, as if people who had been holding their breath could exhale in small measures. I felt that exhale like a supply line opening. It was not gratitude alone, it was a cautious recalibration. Later, in the privacy of my office, I opened Eleanor's sealed letter. Her handwriting was the precise, slanted script of someone who had written terms and wills and memos by hand for decades. The letter did not dictate. It offered a choice: sell and walk away with the means to do anything, or stay and attempt to steward the company differently. "You are not being offered an easy path," she wrote. "You are being offered a station. Use it wisely." The words were both invitation and warning. Selling would simplify a life that had been complicated by loyalty and grief, and it would allow me to reclaim hours long surrendered to endless quarterly cycles. Staying would mean asserts caretaking, rearranging priorities within the company, and, perhaps most painfully, choosing to be present in a life that had been distracted by work for too long. I folded the letter back along its crease and set it aside. The choice would not present itself as a bright decision with glittering benefits. It would be a slow decision, measured in small tastes and sacrifices. I knew then that Eleanor's test had not only been of Hazel, it was a test of me. Could I translate legal ownership into moral stewardship? Could I apologize to the people whose lives had been disrupted by the efficiency-driven policies I had once defended? Could I confront the ledger of my private omissions and begin to balance it? Outside, the atrium's light softened into afternoon. The tulips in their cardboard box lay like a small memory. I picked one up and held it between my fingers. The petal was cool and damp. It crumpled at the edges like currency that had been spent. Waiting had won me the legal right. But law is a map, not a destination. The work of leadership would be less about the rightness of a filing and more about the choices that followed. Small, daily, human. I put the tulip back in the box, closed the lid with a small, decisive motion, and looked at the fountain pen. Its gold cap caught the light. I clicked it open, and for a moment the nib hovered like a question. Then I set it down beside the photograph of my mother, and without yet deciding what to write, I began to draft the questions that would guide the next weeks. Who must we protect? Who must we listen to? How do we repair the harm that was promised as progress? What does stewardship mean when you have inherited both a company's wealth and its wounds? The pen rested on the paper, an instrument of intention more than action for now. Outside, the hum of the building carried on. Inside, something small and resolute began to take form, a plan that would not be simple, and a promise that would not erase the past. I folded the paper back and put the pen down, but the questions did not stop. They multiplied like ledger entries. Who must we protect? Who must we listen to? How do we repair the harm promised as progress? Those questions became the first items on a list that smelled faintly of coffee and corporate stationery. They were not speeches, they were protocols, and they would take longer than a press cycle to complete. The board meeting that afternoon was procedural in tone, but loaded with consequence. We began with confirmations to the SEC and a brief legal recital of the transfer. It was the kind of language that contains fireproofing, precise, unadorned, designed to leave little room for theatrical interpretation. Margaret Hamilton, who had been on the board since the early days, spoke first. She wore her experience like a cardigan, quiet and steady. "It's effective. The registrar confirms it," she said. Her voice held no triumph, only a measured relief that paperwork had done what time and law promised. Robert Pierce nodded, his face the particular mixture of profit and pragmatism that had made him a director. Sarah Kimball read the documents aloud, as if rhythm could make facts cleave more cleanly through rumor. When Marcus asked for a vote of confidence in my temporary stewardship, he did so not as an ultimatum, but as an invitation to deliberate. There were questions, not about legality, but about instinct and reputation. "How will you move without appearing vindictive?" Robert asked. How do we avoid the perception that we're doing this to settle scores? I answered as plainly as I could. Eleanor's instructions required us to wait and gather evidence. That's what we've done. Now the work is to translate legal power into governance that prevents this kind of cruelty from being mistaken for leadership. I spoke of audits, of independent reviews of Hazel's proposals, of a moratorium on layoffs until a cross-functional committee could report. It sounded bureaucratic because it was. Bureaucracy is what keeps corporations from being tyrannies. Patricia leaned forward and said, "You must be careful to separate personal grievance from organizational necessity. The company will survive either model, but people will not." That was the crux. People would not survive unless we treated them as more than numbers. I proposed a three-pronged initial plan: immediate freeze on any headcount reductions for 45 days, a task force combining HR, operations, and staff representatives to review the purported redundancies, and a communication line directly to me for employees who felt endangered by the reorganization. It was small-sounding, but each measure demanded resources, time, and a willingness to resist financial short-termism. Marcus, pragmatic as ever, agreed to chair the task force. We will budget for a proper review. If there are efficiencies to be found, fine. But let's do it with information and with dignity, he said. His endorsement was not a public flourish, but an operational commitment, which suited me perfectly. We decided together not to call a press conference. The transfer had already leaked enough to satisfy curiosity. The story would take shape in filing databases and shareholder notices. I wanted to make decisions without the theatricality that Hazel had used as armor. A quiet office, legality in hand, and a commitment to steady process felt truer to Eleanor's way. Hazel's departure was handled with an odd mix of formality and relief. She submitted her resignation letter that afternoon, an affair of 2 paragraphs that read like a practice closing. She did not pick up calls, and when she did finally appear to collect belongings from her office, she was all composure and tight smiles. I met her in the atrium by the glass wall. Sunlight cut across her shoulders like a rim of someone leaving a stage. "You deserve a fare tomorrow," I told her, and meant it. The offer we extended was a severance package that reflected both her rank and the uneasy recognition that a clean exit was better for everyone. We did not pursue punitive measures. There was no relish in her leaving, only a sober acknowledgement of the costs of leadership performed without regard for the people under its shadow. She accepted the severance with a grace that suggested she had always anticipated exits would be part of the job description. "I'll make it a story someday," she said, voice level. I didn't ask what kind. People leave for reasons, and people leave with explanations. I kept mine to the fact that she had been given a choice and had made one. Unsettled staff needed more than procedures. They needed the reassurance that someone heard them. I held a town hall that evening, not as a performance, but as a listening session. The atrium seats had been set in a semicircle to avoid hierarchy. Maya sat at my right, a reminder of the human face of our operations. I walked slowly through questions and did not promise miracles. I promised truth. A junior analyst named Thomas spoke first. He described the sleeplessness of his partner, wondering whether their job would vanish and whether the mortgage checks would clear next month. Sandra, the receptionist who'd always run errands for the office holiday party, talked about the anxiety of being the glue for a family and the fear that new policy language could mean her hours would be replaced by automation. Their words were small and immediate and lodged like pebbles in my chest. We did not fix everything that night. We started an emergency hardship fund to help employees at risk of sudden income loss, using discretionary funds from the board's contingency line. We opened a direct channel for anonymous reporting about coercive tactics in the reorganization. We announced the 45-day pause on layoffs and committed to full audits of any department being considered for cuts. In the quiet that followed the town hall, Maya hugged me as if she had been waiting for permission to breathe. "People needed you to say something," she whispered. "Not spin, not platitudes, something real." "It's what Eleanor wanted," I said, "and what I wanted eventually. We will be measured by what happens in the next months, not in tonight's applause." Months is the right unit for leading a company. Change that matters is rarely swift. It requires process, patience, and the hard labor of shifting institutional appetite. Over the next weeks, we dug into data. Daniel led the operational audit with a steady focus. He had a way of translating human stories into operational risk that made numbers weep. The task force uncovered redundancies that were real and others that were the byproduct of sloppy planning. Teams duplicated for the sake of appearances, reporting lines that served ego more than function. We made decisions. Some roles were consolidated but accompanied by retraining and redeployment funds. Some contracts were renegotiated. Some positions, particularly in support functions, were prioritized for retention because the cost of losing institutional knowledge outweighed hypothetical savings. I kept Eleanor's pen in my pocket more often than was strictly professional, a talisman and a reminder of the legal and moral weight I carried. Not every employee believed us at first. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it does to break. There were rumors about secret agendas and doubts cast by those who had been burned before. I visited manufacturing floors, stayed late with teams, and listened until my throat was raw. The ledger of small courtesies matters, answering an email at a reasonable hour, praising a specific action rather than flattering a team, remembering a subordinate's child's name. These were not grand plans, but the stitches of ordinary governance. At night I did the other work, phone calls to my sister, dinners that were not scheduled around conference calls, a visit to my mother's grave with a small bouquet instead of the drooping tulips that had become a relic. The physical act of standing by that headstone felt like an entry in an account book. Credit, debit, an attempt to balance. I spoke aloud about the choices I had made, confessed what I still owed, and asked permission to try to do better. Confession in the cemetery felt personal and unperformative in a way the office rarely did. It was necessary. The media asked for comment. I gave measured statements that avoided the theater. This was deliberate. I wanted the company to be known for steadiness and accountability rather than personal drama. Social channels filled with both support and sneers. People are quick to love a narrative of villainy and redemption. I resisted the lure of controlling the narrative. Control, I had learned, often masquerades as inertia. In the third week, the task force issued a report that surprised some and satisfied others. The report found that Hazel's proposed cuts would have saved money in the short term, but at the cost of long-term capability. It recommended a recalibrated plan, focusing on technology investments that could automate certain tasks, but only after human roles were offered training and alternative positions. We set aside a budget line for that retraining. The finance team did the math in cold columns and produced projections that showed initial dips for midterm gains, a trade-off that demanded faith from stakeholders. The board, now working with me rather than simply around me, voted to approve the recommended plan. That vote was not unanimous. Board decisions rarely are. Some directors worried about investor confidence. Other investors worried about reputation. We balanced those concerns by drafting a timeline with measurable milestones and public updates at quarterly intervals. Transparency became our shorthand for accountability. Through it all, I felt an undercurrent of guilt. The policies I was pushing to protect people were things I could have, perhaps should have, advocated for earlier in my career. I had defended certain efficiency measures in the past because the numbers looked neat and because leadership was often judged by the skinny margins it delivered. It took the sting of public erasure and the instruction of a dying mentor to recalibrate my priorities. That did not absolve me. It made me responsible. Eleanor's sealed letter sat on my desk like a quiet accusation. Her offer was generous. The option to sell and walk away with enough means to recast my life, and the option to stay and steward the company with all that responsibility implied. I delayed choosing because both options felt like moral tests. Selling would make life easier in a straightforward way. Staying would be an act of public penance and the promise of hard work. One evening, Patricia invited me to her home for dinner. We sat in a library that smelled of old paper and citrus, and she poured wine like slow counsel. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked. I thought of the people whose names I had written on the margin of the task force reports. I thought of my sister's voice on the phone. I thought of the small acts of care that had been neglected. I thought of Eleanor's steady hand and of the fountain pen she had given me. "Stay," Patricia said when I still did not answer. "You've been given a gift that costs. If you can do it, then do it. If the work becomes vanity, then choose otherwise. But if you can use it to change how this company treats people, stay." That night I opened Eleanor's letter again. Her handwriting, neat and deliberate, told a story I had read before, in Policies and in Persönlichkeit. "You did not reach this by accident," she had written. "If you choose to stay, do not be the leader you think the markets want. Be the leader that people want when they come to work sober and tired. It is harder. If you cannot do that, then sell. There is no shame in walking away. There is shame in using power without regard." The moral clarity of her words did not erase the complexity of the decision. Standing at the window with the city lights flickering like an accounting, I thought of leaving. I thought of a life where my hours belonged more to people I loved than to a balance sheet. The allure was real, but I also thought of the families who had breathed easier with the pause on layoffs, of the manufacturing line that kept humming because someone decided to retrain rather than replace, of the receptionist who would still be able to pay the mortgage because we had slowed down the guillotine of automation long enough to give her options. I wrote my answer carefully. "I will stay," I said, "but I will do so on terms. We will change governance. We will prioritize people in our metrics. We will set an annual stewardship audit to report on how policy impacts employees' lives. And I will, personally, be present in a way I have not been." I signed the reply and felt a softness like an eased muscle. Choosing to stay was both vow and tether. The next months were dense with paperwork and personality. We restructured the leadership team, not to punish past sins, but to diversify perspectives. I brought in a new Chief Human Resources Officer with a public record of employee-centered transformations. We started a mentorship program that paired senior leaders with frontline staff for 3-month rotations so that executive policy would be informed by floor-level realities. We created an employee advisory council with representation from across departments and levels. Their mandates included reviewing proposed reorganizations and evaluating proposed cost-saving measures for human impact. Some changes were symbolic but necessary. We repurposed a suite once reserved for executive strategy meetings into a shared workspace where teams could hold cross-functional sessions. We ditched efficiency as a conversational shortcut and replaced it internally with durable productivity, which sounded less like a broadcast and more like a commitment. Not all was smooth. The investor community grumbled about short-term performance. Our stock dipped on the news that we were slowing cuts in favor of investment. We weathered uncomfortable Q&A sessions, but we also saw improved retention in the support teams, fewer anonymous reports of coercive tactics, and, painfully but importantly, more conversation about quality of life at work. The human capital metrics we monitored, turnover, employee satisfaction, survey scores, usage of retraining budgets, moved in ways that were meaningful, though not immediately profitable. The hardest part was personal. The slow, ongoing repair of relationships I had neglected. I took deliberate time with my sister, showing up on a weekend for a brunch I might once have missed. I visited my mother's grave and read a passage from The Art of War, the one Eleanor had dog-eared about timing, not as a battle cry, but as a strategy for care. I began to write in my own journal, messy entries that recorded not spreadsheets, but things like called Joan and ate dinner uninterrupted. They were small absolutions. Maya stayed by my side in more ways than one. She became the person in the building who kept me tethered to the human currents, an internal conscience who would remind me gently when I erred towards distance. Daniel continued to be the operational anchor, Patricia the board's moral accountant, and Marcus the steady procedural hand. Hazel's departure receded into the company memory as these changes took hold. She resurfaced in the press once, quoted about leadership being a muscle that sometimes needs to be exercised in the open. I read the interview with a mixture of vacuity and understanding. People fracture in different ways. Public exits do not erase private ambition. Sometimes, late at night, when the office was quiet and the city hummed into a different frequency, I would take out Eleanor's fountain pen and feel its weight. I wrote letters that were not for the press, apologies to teams whose voices I had not prioritized, notes to employees who had shown courage in small acts, and a long letter to my sister, which in places read like a confession and in others like a promise. Writing with that nib felt like a conversation with the past and with the person I hoped to become. One of the more delicate tasks was the reconciliation with my own ledger of sacrifice. Material restitution couldn't buy back time, and no policy, however compassionate, could replace the quiet hours I had missed with my mother. What I could do, and what I attempted, was to honor that absence by making my decisions in a way that reduced the chances of others having to make similar trade-offs. That was never going to be a perfect solution. It was, at best, an attempt to turn a personal cost into public care. There were quieter victories. The receptionist's mortgage stabilized after redeployment adjustments. The analyst, who had worried about the long commute, was offered flex time and a stipend to cover transit for a year. The production supervisor moved into a role that leveraged his technical knowledge in process improvement rather than headcount consolidation. These were not headlines. They were small, stubborn instances of dignity. We also instituted a stewardship metric that became part of our quarterly reporting, a mix of employee retention, internal promotion rates, and time to retrain for displaced roles. It was not exactly sexy, but it shaped choices. The finance team had to learn to value a different set of numbers. Some investors left, others stayed because they too had long-term perspectives. The company did not instantly become utopian. It became, I hoped, better. Eleanor's letter remained an anchor. I kept it in the portfolio for a long time, opening it now and then as one opens a map to check that one is still on course. Her handwriting reminded me of the bargain, authority held with humility. The fountain pen, once hers, had become mine, and I treated its ink as a responsibility. One afternoon, months into this new regimen, a young employee named Kevin approached me in the atrium with a small box. He worked in procurement and had, for months, quietly logged ideas on how to repurpose excess inventory into community donations. "You asked us to tell you when we saw something," he said, voice shy. "This is one of those things." Inside the box were tulip bulbs, small and wrapped. He had noticed how the dying tulips had become a symbol in the office and wanted to offer a living alternative, bulbs that could be planted and would come back each year. "They're the kind that come up reliably," he said. "Maybe they could be in the courtyard." I laughed, which startled him into a grin, and felt the particular warmth that comes from unexpected human gestures. It was such a small thing, a horticultural suggestion, that the relief it brought felt almost indecent. I accepted and, later that week, arranged for bulbs to be planted in the courtyard, a small public regenerative act. On the day the courtyard tulips first opened, I walked through the glass doors and saw the bright cups of color like small exclamations. People paused. Someone took a photograph and sent it to a colleague who had been furloughed months before and was now back in a retrained role. It was a tiny proof that patience and process could yield beauty, not just profits. The work continued. There were board meetings and quarterly reports and difficult conversations about talent and succession planning. There were staff meetings where I apologized openly for my past absences and then, more importantly, listened. There were regulatory check-ins and audits in the daily grind that turns policy into habit or lets it collapse into rhetoric. When I look back on this season, I think of small thresholds. The SEC filing had been a hinge. The town hall and the task force were the hands that slowly turned a door. Eleanor's last lesson about patience and the pen remained a compass. There were nights when I still crumpled into regret, and days when a single thank you from a team lead felt like a down payment on meaning. I learned that leadership is not the grand gesture. It is the accumulation of small, steady acts. It is also the willingness to be accountable publicly for decisions that have private cost. The company did not become a moral utopia overnight. We traded some short-term gains for the longer, harder work of building resilience that cared for people. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, we commissioned a small plaque in the atrium, not as a shrine, but as a reminder, for stewardship. The fountain pen remained on my desk, its cap slightly worn from use. I had replaced the cardboard box of wilted tulips with a small vase of new ones, fresh, alive, placed under the plaque. They were not theatrical. They were a promise to remember that small things matter. There is a particular humility in having been both humiliated and vindicated within the memory of the same week. It teaches a person to distrust simple narratives. Being fired on day one and secretly owning the company is, as a story, almost too tidy. The truth was messier. The legal victory was real and necessary, but it required the slow, unglamorous labor of governance to make it meaningful. I still carry guilt about my mother. I still miss the hours I cannot get back. But choosing to stay was not a way to negate that absence. It was a way to ensure that others might not have to count the same costs for their careers. I applied the same questions. Who must we protect? To every decision. Sometimes the answer required dollars. Sometimes it required patience. Sometimes it required the courage to say, I was wrong, and then to work to make amends. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, I sat at my desk and opened the portfolio. I took out the fountain pen and on a blank page wrote a short note, one sentence, not for publication, but for the record. Leadership is less about titles and more about the courage to act with care. I closed the pen, and for the first time in a long while, felt my hands steady. Outside, the courtyard tulips bowed gently in a cool breeze. They were ordinary in the way that small, resilient things are, quiet proof that something living returns after neglect. I thought of Eleanor and of the pen she had given me, and of the long list of names that had moved me to stay. Justice in our case had been transactional and legal. Stewardship, which I had chosen, was the daily work that followed. It would not erase the ledger lines, but it could change how they accumulated for others. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, like and comment which moment mattered most. Was it the waiting, the reveal, or the choice to stay?